Hi, I'm Hannah,
And I'm Lydia.
and we are a pair of bookends.
And we were just hoping that we could interrupt this episode to ask you very kindly if you would sign up to our Patreon.
Yes, if you have some spare change rattling around in your pocket, we would so appreciate it if you could go over to patreon.com/a pair of bookends where you can support our work. We have been doing this podcast for nearly 2 years now, and we wanted the opportunity to get to know some of you a little better. And via our Patreon, as well as getting exclusive benefits, you can also have the opportunities to share your own recommendations with us and to chat with us. And it's just a nice place for us to have our own little hub.
For less than the price of a coffee, you can get exclusive Patreon-only benefits, such as our Patreon exclusive book club, where you get to pick the book that we read each month, and also
early access to all podcast episodes,
and your chance to ask our authors your own questions.
So please do, if you can, sign up to our Patreon via patreon.com/a pair of bookends and support our work. We would appreciate it more than you can imagine, and it helps us hugely to bring you all the extra special stuff.
So come and officially become a bookend.
Now on to today's episode. Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. We are your hosts and hopefully your new bookish pals. I'm Hannah MacDonald.
And I'm Lydia Clare. Welcome to our debut Spotlight series, where we shine a light on the freshest authors and their work. Today we shine a light on How to Be Somebody Else, a brilliant debut set in New York City, where we follow Dylan as she navigates living in a foreign country when she unexpectedly embarks on an affair that gets her to ask questions about who she really is. Sharp, well-observed, and remarkable. We had to share this one with you.
Miranda Pountney is a writer from London. She holds a BA in English Literature from Oxford University and an MA in Creative Writing from Bath Spa University. Prior to her MA, she also embarked on a career in advertising, both in London and New York. How to Be Somebody Else is her debut novel, published by Jonathan Cape, and we are so excited to be chatting to Miranda herself today. Welcome to A Pair of Bookends.
Hi, thank you for having me. Really happy to be on.
Thank you for coming on.
We are so excited to speak to you today. But before we delve into the book, which we cannot wait to talk about, we have to ask you, what are you currently reading?
I am actually rereading a novel at the moment, which is one of my favourites. It came out first in the 90s, I think, but was re-released in the UK just before the first lockdown, which is when I discovered it. And it's called In the Cut. I don't know if you guys have read it. It's by an American author called Susanna Moore. And it's about an English teacher in 60s New York who begins a journey of fairly graphic sexual discovery with the lead detective in a murder investigation, a pretty brutal murder investigation. And as the novel progresses, she begins to suspect that he might be the culprit. It is a really page-turning book and at times quite shocking, particularly given when it came out as well. It must have been even more so then, but quite shocking exploration of the dark depths of female desire and male desire. But also it's just written in the most beautiful, taut prose that is so precise and propulsive and sets this queasy tone that she just holds to the end of the novel. And even though this is like a third reading for me, I find I'm kind of holding my breath while I'm reading it. It's one of those, so highly recommend. Yeah.
Oh my goodness,
I
that
am
sounds incredible.
Sold.
Yeah, it is absolutely great. I mean, the book, we were talking just before, the book stack is kind of heaving at the moment, so I shouldn't really be reading something for the third time, but you know when you just have to go back to something, it's that kind of mood. Yeah. But yeah, it's brilliant. Really recommend it.
I can't believe I've never read that. I have heard of it before. I feel like they talked about it on the Hilo podcast when that was around.
But there was a movie of it that was directed by, which is I think a lot of people heard of, which was directed by Jane Campion, who's wonderful. But the movie kind of jumped the shark a bit. They changed the ending, but it was really heard about because it was like the first time Meg Ryan did Full Frontal. And you're just like, it was like, is that really news? But there's also a very hot young Mark Ruffalo in it. So I recommend it for that alone. But the book is book is spectacular. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I'm dead excited. You're already adding to my never-ending pile of books, so thanks so
I know,
much
it's
for that.
dangerous.
It is.
Now, we always start our debut spotlight series by asking what your writing process has been like in writing your debut novel and what the kind of road to publication has been like. But I'm very interested in the fact that you completed your BA, then you went off to work in advertising, and then you came back to do an MA in creative writing. So I kind of want to know, were you always writing throughout, and at what point did your book start for you?
It's funny. I mean, advertising is an interesting industry. I love to mock it, but it is actually, I mean, depending on which agency you work in, it is full of a lot of quite smart, creative people, but it is also kind of the field of broken dreams, right? So every copywriter wishes they were writing a book, and every director, and so everyone's clinging on to this sort of 60 seconds, like how can we express everything, so it's a great environment for people who are trying to get things done. But I think, taking the plunge is a different thing. I don't know, you guys are both actresses, right?
Yes, yeah.
You always followed that path, or did you sort of do anything before, or
I feel like when I graduated from uni, I kind of got roped into working as a manager at the restaurant I was working at, but that was like that was just I got pulled into that, and it was money, and acting does not make us much money if we're not like Hollywood actors, like
yeah, that's the thing about the creative industries. And it felt like quite a safe thing to go into out of university. It was kind of adjacent to creativity, and then you get used to the security, and it offered me the chance to go. Every time you try and quit, something pops up, and then there was the chance to go to New York, and then to stay there I had to be employed by them until I got a green card. So I was sort of like complicit in being slightly trapped in it, but it was quite a long career. It was like, I was in it for about 13-14 years.
Wow.
And then I had to come back to the UK unexpectedly for family reasons, and that meant I was living it for a while near Bath, which is where my parents live, and found out about the Bath Spa MA, and I thought, well, do you know what, I'm here, there's no plan, now's as good a time as any. And it was quite an extreme plunge, because until then I just had tons of notebooks. I would say the thing that I was confident in was my observations. Do you know what I mean? It was like you have that sense that you're seeing life in a particular way, or you're reverberating at quite a high level with things. And so I was confident in that, but actually, getting that to amount to something is completely different. So yeah, I applied to the MA. Luckily I got in, and at the time I didn't really have an idea for a book. Which is why, this book is not about me, but it's based in a lot of the things that I've been, because I'm like, if you're, writing about identity and searching, you couldn't have a better setting than New York, and particularly, advertising, which is so full of people desperate to express and failing to, so I sort of stuck with all of that and started from there. And I think people are quite skeptical about writing MAs. I see, people love to hate them online for whatever reason, but I cannot tell you how lucky I was to do this. I think it's not because I think writing is something you can teach particularly, but the privilege of being able to block off a year for this, or at least primarily for this, to make that statement of intention to yourself. I don't know if there was a moment for you guys in acting where you're like, this is me taking myself seriously. This isn't a hobby. I mean this now, and I have to, place some bets. And of course, then you're also alongside other people doing exactly the same, which it's such a solitary thing, writing. And also the publishing industry feels so opaque. To be around other writers, and then other published writers who you're, the ones who are tutoring you, benefiting from that experience. And there's also this sort of amazing kind of cross-fertilization, because, all the tutors were all from different genres. And in my second term, it was an absolute nightmare. Ended up on a poetry module, which I had not put myself up for. And other than maybe stand-up comedy, writing poetry is my worst nightmare, So it was a lot of effort just to not humiliate myself in that. But it ended up probably being the most beneficial thing for my novel writing, because the economy of language and that razor-sharp focus that poetry has on the telling detail, and also how acutely aware you are of describing something in an obvious or banal way after having tried to write poetry. Incredibly helpful. Anyway, I'm babbling. But in the final term of the course, you get to work one-on-one with a published writer. And have you read any Tessa Hadley? I'm sure you've heard of Tessa Hadley.
I've heard of her, but I've not read it yet.
She's absolutely, she probably is one of the great short story writers of this moment. I think she's had maybe 33 short stories published in the New Yorker,
Wow.
which is fairly extraordinary. She's also written 4 beautiful novels and is just the most generous reader, which is what you really need on a course like this. So she helped me enormously. And then that last time you're just focused on a single manuscript. And then I sort of had such a dream scenario that I almost want to lie because it makes you sound very lucky. But Tessa shared it with her publisher, my manuscript, which was at the time probably only about 30,000 words. So it's like 100 pages in.
Right.
And this was, so right after the course, they liked it. I met with Jonathan Cape. Then I met with an agent. So it was a sort of a backwards thing.
Wow.
And there was a book deal just based on this section. So I had the incredible experience of finishing the book with that support behind me, some money to pay rent, some wonderful editors in the background. So it really was an unusual and incredibly privileged journey.
Yeah, that's incredible.
And everything to thank that course for. And Tessa doing that, I think was unusual and amazing. And I'll be, forever grateful.
Wow. I mean, I'm always like so surprised at the differences in debut authors' kind of experiences. And we recently interviewed Madeline Gray, and she had sort of a similar like bout of luck, but obviously it isn't just down to luck, it's about your talent. They were presenting a piece of work of yours, so it wasn't just like, oh, you just got slipped in through the back door. Like, that's not how it works. They saw your work.
You're like, I've muscled in on this one. I think what was so nice about it, because there is, obviously the book is not separate from the writing, but the book wasn't finished, so to have a publisher buy into your writing is just a really nice beginning to what I hope will be a long journey of working with them, which is like, believing in that part of you versus, whether this book takes off or doesn't. It was a lovely, I did get a bit of stage fright. I still, despite that validation, I made a bit of a meal of it, because I think it's a bit like, when you're writing your first novel, you don't really expect anyone to ever see it, and there's something quite free about that. And then suddenly, oh wow, it's getting published by Jonathan Cape, I better step it up a bit. And so I was a little bit paralyzed, and I also wasn't one of the stoics of lockdown. The number of stories you hear about writers who were just like, oh, I wrote my novel in lockdown. I just literally was just like, oh my god, I'm too obsessed about Sainsbury's deliveries, how can I possibly but yeah, so no, it was a really wonderful experience. I'm very lucky.
We are so glad that you did get that bout of luck, because we absolutely love this book. And I would just like to start, before we delve into the book, with just reading a little bit of it back to you, if that's okay. Because I think it really helps to kind of demonstrate how brilliant you are with words, and also a little bit about the tone of the book. So I'm just gonna go from, it's just at the start of the novel, and it's about Dylan talking about the book The Artist's Way, and that she's got the artist's way. So, recommended by a friend as a tool for unblocking creativity. The Way to Art is the title they'd actually given, which is more honest about the art being over there, usually, while you are over here. It's divided into 13 weeks, each with its own chapter, then various tasks, all of them mortifying. Also, daily free writing, which seems too obvious a contradiction to attempt. This is a library copy, bookmarks abandoned at different stages, like corpses on Everest.
It's so good.
So good. Like that, I just, as soon as I finished that sentence, I was like, I need to reread this all over again. This is just such a fantastically crafted piece of work.
Oh, I love that.
Just absolutely brilliant. And again, that kind of brilliant approach that you've got in terms of tone and the feel of the book is what makes it so unique. What was it like for you to craft that tone and develop that tone throughout?
It's funny, it's probably the main, I think for me, rhythm is so important. That probably sounds a bit pretentious, but when you think again about me talking about sort of being fairly new to writing when I began this, it was the one thing that I felt I had a real set of instincts about, which was whether or not the energy was coming across in the rhythm, if that makes sense. So it was so much about getting to the texture of a moment. You know, it's one of those books where most of the landmarks, I would say, are internal. And so it's how do you build the texture of that feeling as it happens. It's quite hard to describe. I think I knew when I hadn't nailed it, and that was the process of editing. So in each chapter there was a particular, if you think of it like a sort of like a tuning fork, you're going for like an A minor. It's like, have I got it, you know? And so it was much more led by that kind of thing than necessarily knowing what was going to happen next. Or I think the plot sort of revealed itself, whereas that other piece was something I really, you know, I think probably, you know, next time around I remember Tessa, again, to just talk about Tessa, talking about, you know, the challenge of the novel being to hold this huge thing in your head. You know, it is a massive piece of engineering versus, for example, the short story, which I love the way she describes as wonderfully irresponsible. You know, in the short story, you're sort of really, it's a razor sharp focus on the essence of the thing or an aperture on a moment or whatever. And I think she described the novel like sort of building a bridge out over a river, you know. And I think learning about how to draft is having the best possible sense of how that bridge is going to land, what's on the other side that's worth getting to, etc., versus like, you know, look at the brickwork at the beginning, or what's the view like from the middle, which I tend to get a bit caught up in because I love things at a line level. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but for me, the sort of the craft part is the bit I feel I have most instinct with.
I think so much about, sorry, Hannah, I think so much about the writing process is about instinct. A lot of it is instinct. And I think that the best writers are the writers that have great instincts, but not necessarily have the kind of, this is how you do it, like the map of how you do it. And sometimes I think, you know, like you were saying about like MAs and things, people say, oh, you know, the true writers can just write. And it's like, well, sometimes you have the instincts, but you need the kind of tutelage in terms of like, oh, well, this is how I channel those instincts in the correct way. So
yeah,
no,
you need readers, you know. It's such a, I mean, that's why this course is so wonderful. You know, you guys know, we were just talking about, you know, it's all about having too many things to read and not enough time. It's actually a real gift when someone takes the time to go through your work. And luckily on this course, everyone has to, or they don't. But quite often, the solution or the insight comes from someone who's writing something completely different to you. I mean, I'm not particularly a fantasy reader, for example. And there was a girl in our group writing this sort of werewolves thing. And, you know, I wouldn't have been her reader and she wouldn't have been my reader. But some of her comments were the most useful things. And I think also when you're learning, the answers are so simple. You know, they're all to be found in well, sorry, not all of the answers, but craft wise, they're all to be found in the books of the writers you love. Sometimes it's just like, oh shit, I just need a line break. You know, you're tortured about. And also I think it's, you know, very simple things like trusting the reader. I think, you know they're not going to think that person is sitting on the toilet for the rest of the novel because they haven't stood up and pulled their pants up. You know, they can figure that out. And I think one of the things that was so interesting to me about working with great editors as well is how much they do leave it to you. How, you know, they've got you on board because they believe in your writing, and it's about getting you to trust those instincts rather than forcing something on you. I mean, I remember being really relieved when finally I got a final draft to them, because I thought, oh, it will be, you know, 3 weeks of my pages on the floor and we'll just, so, you know, it was like a couple of paragraphs, which was like, this is where the heat is, this is where it's not working, you know, see you next time. And I was like, oh crap, I have to write it myself. You know, but it was a wonderful experience. And I think the first one is, you know, for me, it was, despite the lovely beginning I had, quite long and torturous because I was still finding my voice as a writer, and I really wanted to get as close as I could to something I felt very proud of. But I think the next one, yeah, there will be all sorts of different ways of approaching it, you know.
Yeah, and I really want to push further into the book because I need to talk about Dylan, who is your protagonist. Now, it is quite an annoying thing that people say to writers of their debut novel about, you know, as we were saying before, about how much of it is true to your life and your own experiences. But there are some similarities between your journey and the things that Dylan goes through. I'm not sure to what extent, but we don't need to go into that. But I love getting stuck in.
I really want to answer that question, but we'll
No, I'm not, I'm not suggesting anything, but I love getting stuck into characters like Dylan that
Yeah.
are kind of so full of complexities, and the novel feels like a very much like a pressure cooker, but she is the pressure cooker, and we are kind of witnessing her make these chaotic choices that, aren't always the most beneficial to her. And I wanted to ask, what was the inspiration for Dylan, and what did you want to capture about being at this point in your life that she's at?
Yeah, I mean, I actually started with the character of her and really built the novel around her. So just to address the similarities, even for people who haven't read it yet, I'm not like psychopathic. But I think it's probably a bit of a trope of debut writers to stick a little bit to what you know. But as I was saying, the themes that I was really interested in exploring, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm like, this environment is perfect, and I know it, and I'm going to lean into that. But what happened in my life was I had to quit advertising. I had to come back to England, and I was in my childhood bedroom writing a book, and I was thinking, what might have happened if I quit and stayed in New York? Like, what would it? And I this is not me saying this is what would have naturally it's trying to, I mean, the joy of writing is exploring extremes. And I think, I'm quite a bit of a people pleaser. I don't love confrontation, things like that. So it was really a joy writing a character who says what I couldn't, and who really, I think it's an almost sort of intellectual approach. I mean, there is a bit of a trope at the moment of the sort of the unraveling woman, and it gets very patronizingly called like the sad girl novel or whatever, which is I cannot bear as a description for anything. I remember reading a piece recently in, let's just say, a respected publication, which described The Bell Jar as the original sad girl novel. And it's just so patronizing and flattening of the beauty and complexity of that piece of writing. I mean, is there a sad boy novel? Like, is The Catcher in the Rye a sad boy novel? Do you know what I mean?
All of them are.
Yeah. But I think, there is a sort of sense of somehow there's a state of the nation. If it's a man
Yes.
evolving, there's a state of, this is a commentary on, the futility of striving for greatness in society, whereas a woman falls apart, right? Equally, women write their diaries. It's like, that's why women always get the question in fiction, like, God, how much of this happened to you? And often really inappropriately, when there's like, sexual abuse or something as a topic, it's like, wow, this is fun, But yeah, Dylan is very much a fiction. And I really liked putting her in advertising, because I think I like, versus the unraveling thing, I like the idea of a character who's smart, accomplished, apparently fully formed, and yet somehow persuasive to everyone but herself.
Mm-hmm.
So in advertising, she's literally in the business of persuasion. She can come up with a cohesive proposition for like a scented suppository, but she can't do it for herself. Do you know what I mean? So I did want that journey that she goes on not to be one of unraveling, but a more conscious, almost intellectual exercise, like the same way that she's executed the rest of her life, that's both kind of exhausting and at times very funny, to me at least, and of course doomed to fail. And I think the more intellectual she becomes about the subjects that challenge her, which is of course also a defensive pose, the worse her behavior. You can't step outside of life to experiment it without collateral damage. There will always be consequences. But writing some of those sort of colder moments of hers, I found really difficult. And even things like, I'm sure we'll end up talking about sort of motherhood and things like that, but like her bringing that sort of rational framework to that side of things, I found really hard to write, because it felt so, I don't know, we'll probably talk about it later, but yeah, she was a real joy to write, because I think particularly when you feel quite uncomfortable in some of the things you're writing, you probably got to a good place. I remember Phoebe Waller-Bridge saying that with Fleabag, it wasn't her, but when she got uncomfortable, she knew she got to a rich place. It was touching some kind of nerve that,
I love those kinds of characters though, and I think what I think really struck me, and my stomach just rumbled really loudly, I'm so sorry if you heard that. What really struck me about this character was that all the like bad choices that she was making were things that, you know, there were impulses that she's acting on that I will often tell myself, no, you mustn't do that, because I'm, like you said, I'm a people pleaser. And I'm like, oh, well, I mustn't do that. I mustn't act on my impulses because that's not the right thing to do. But what is the right thing to do, you know? So when she kind of walks out of her career after like 10 years and she's like, I've got no plan, I'm like, you know what? I really respect that. I really respect the fact that she just followed that impulse. And yeah, maybe it wasn't the right thing to do, but in the moment she was like, no, fuck this, like, I'm done. So I really respect that. And I don't know, I wish sometimes that I could be that person, but I just don't think I will be.
Joy of writing fiction, right?
Mhm.
Anything can happen.
Yeah.
And again, I think, a lot of my process was like about how far can I move from my comfort zone of how I might have dealt with a situation. And the further I went, the richer the scene, or the material.
So I am very excited about talking about this, and I know that Hannah will be too. Can we talk about affairs?
We love an affair.
You love affairs.
We love affairs. Let's face it, and we really do love an affair narrative. They bring up so much about human nature, and it's such a brilliant device. But how central was this theme for you in terms of, you wanted to include this affair, and also what do you think it reveals about the characters? And I will say, as a little bit of context for our listeners, that at the very beginning of the novel, Gabe, who is the man she has an affair with, reveals that he's married by saying, oh, by the way, I'm married, but it's not a thing. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear.
I mean, yeah, I'm with you. Who doesn't love a bit of illicit chemistry in life and in fiction? But also, I think it's not, to answer your question, it's not something that I set out to write particularly. As I was saying, I was going for a tone and a texture, and then sort of what was going to get me to it kind of fell in. And I thought when I first started writing this, that this, it's quite an intense single perspective throughout the book. And I thought I could hold that throughout. So this person is going to explore and experiment, this, that, and the other. And it became clear very quickly that I needed situations she could sort of reflect and refract and things like this. And I think it really, an affair in this book makes sense for a novel, which is essentially about the inherent appeal of things that are out of reach, selves that are out of reach, a city that is, its proposition is being out of reach. That's the whole point of the skyline. The second you're in it, it evaporates. You can't see it anymore. And I think also, an affair is necessarily a space of unreality, of uncertainty and half-answered longings. And it's also, again, something so often driven by the desire for change, a desire to feel a set of feelings that have either, I think in the life stage of my characters versus a lot of these things that are coming out at the moment, young girls falling for older men or whatever it might be, but a desire to feel a set of feelings that have either ceased to be accessible or perhaps have never been experienced. I think there's also no easier way to see yourself through new eyes than in a new relationship. You're constantly imagining yourself through the eyes of this other person. It's so much easier than trying to sort of re-envisage yourself. I also think for Dylan, it's so much about timing. Meeting Gabe in like a really split second of porousness. Do you know what I mean? She's hanging over the edge of a fire escape, touching her tongue to an ice cube. A gust of wind sends over smoke from cigarette, and Gabe's attached to the end of it. And who was it? I think it was Joan Didion who said something like, life changes in the instant. You sit down to dinner and life as you know it ends. The big stuff doesn't add up. It happens, it happens in that way. And then I think lastly, practically speaking, there's also a certain amount of life stage involved with the characters I'm writing. Someone of Dylan's age, if the listeners don't know, she's like 38 by the end of the novel. They're more likely to be coupled up or separated or divorced than straightforwardly single. And not to give away any spoilers, but I also like that there's a slightly more complex dynamic at work in the Dylan and Gabe situation. At a certain point, it's unclear who's betraying who and who's betraying themselves and all of that. So, but yeah, it's really rich material. And there's always it's obviously very trodden ground in fiction, but there's always something new to find in it, I think.
I think it's so difficult to talk about this book and tread carefully without giving spoilers. I was so conscious when I was kind of thinking about what we were going to ask you, because I was like, oh, there's so much that I selfishly want to ask about. But we've got to kind of
away anyway. It's my first interview on this, so I'm just gonna like ruin it. Anyway.
No, it was so great, and like we've said so many times on the podcast, like we love an affair narrative, and I think it kind of it's sort of the same thing I was speaking about before, where it's all about impulses and whether you act on that impulse or not. And as you just said, life happens in these like small moments. It's not like so the affair is the big thing, but it's all about that little choice that's made, and those little choices that continue to be made. And I think that's fascinating to watch happen. I enjoyed watching her continue to make those choices, even though she probably knew it wasn't the right thing to do. And I think she says at one point about herself, like, oh, she really was a prize cunt. and I and I was like, gosh,
I truly love that word. I know I overuse
so good.
But it's just it's criminally neglected, I feel.
It really is. It's very refreshing. I enjoyed it.
And sometimes no other word will work.
This is true.
So
but yeah, I think also, an affair is another way of kind of hedging. I think New York is really, I mean, it's such a clever, thinking of this advertising world, and at the beginning she's working on Tourism New York, so it really gets her sort of trying to think about the idea that she's put herself in. But it is, it's obviously a really important character in both the place, of course, but more so New York, the emotion, it's really is the city that is the psychic home of the fantasist. And this novel is so much about fantasy, ideas of the self, of other people, how we build and dismantle these, the chasm between the reality and the perception. I think also the idea of arriving in New York is inescapably symbolic. It's so much connected with the idea of change. But what's so clever about it is it doesn't require you to articulate what that change is. It's this big statement of intention. I'm arriving in New York, but then there's the kind of ... And it's like, it's funny to me that the city has such a reputation for, driven people who are going after what they want. When in my experience, which is admittedly, small in my corner of the city, but the thing most people had in common was they were still trying to articulate what they want. And that's what brought them to the city, So you have this kind of raging, untethered ambition, because the cost of entry is so high. Everyone's in these insane jobs and they really look like they mean them. But that sort of untetheredness is, it's galvanizing, but at a certain point can become quite manic. So the city then becomes quite an interesting melting pot of people in a state of in-betweenness, which is why I was interested in a cast of characters who've been there for a long time. It's not that wide-eyed arrival, but something more complex and thorny, where the yearning is a bit more weary and the promise of the city is kind of flagging. And I think, on the in-betweenness thing, I think an affair is the ultimate state of in-betweenness, isn't it? It's not, if New York is about keeping a foot in the door, like Dylan still with Matt, starting with, it's a sort of not quite committing. I mean, here is a character who is like horrified by the idea that everything you choose is instead of something else. And New York is full of those people. It's one of the most obvious truths, but it's kind of, it's a horrible thought, isn't it? Every choice you make is instead of something else. Anyway.
That's quite an existential thought for the morning.
As I said it, I was like, it sounds incredibly obvious, but at the same time, it's like,
no,
isn't that what drives us crazy in life?
Yes, yeah, 100%. And weirdly, you've just completely answered my next question, which was going to be about New York. No, not at all. Don't be sorry. It's lovely to hear you chat about it, because New York is one of my favorite places. I've only visited once. Conveniently, my university had a trip to New York in our final year. It was the same week as my 21st birthday, so it was very convenient for me.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
So I absolutely loved it, and I definitely romanticized the idea of New York before I'd gone there, and it had this magical hold over me. Like I don't know what it was about the city, but it was just so it was so bursting with life. it's a really like bustling city. You know, they say it's a city that never sleeps, and I feel like that's so true. And you really get a sense of that in this novel, that this is where all the kind of magic happens and all the excitement happens. And I think that's why she doesn't want to leave.
It's also the great pressure of the city, though, because it's like the threat and the promise of something might happen at any moment,
Yes.
but also nothing might happen.
Yes.
You know, and I think what you're describing, that feeling, can carry you for a really long time. And there is this feeling of, and to be honest, it's why I moved there when I did. I sort of, you know, life was okay. I've got friends that I love, but I could see the next 10 years in the same sort of 3 pubs and engagement parties, this, that, and the other. And I'm like, that's fine, but I need something else. And I think New York sort of resets the clock, but also in a way, you can find yourself delegating. It's that thing I was saying about arriving there as such a statement of intention, that there is a lot of, I don't know, you can become quite passive at that point. It's like, well, I've done it, got there. And the city provides its own sense of momentum for a really long time. And I think Dylan, I think there's a point where she sort of has, because she's in a manic job and she's in a manic city and she's got, you know, she's quite established. I think there is a moment where she suddenly realizes that despite seeming to be engaged in life, she is also somehow a passive witness to it. And I think there is a sort of a crossing over point in New York. And it's so funny because the new blood comes in, because there's so much churn versus, you know, living in London, or at least for me, you know, a lot of school friends ended up there and university friends, you know, a lot of people, and you end up sort of continuing patterns and things like that. Whereas in New York, people are arriving and leaving the whole time. So it's kind of like there's a bit of a relay race for the energy. Like, so you're flagging, but someone new arrives and that, you know, they can keep the dream alive. It's like, well, so excited to see the thing, whatever. And there is this kind of feeding off each other thing. And I think it's something I really enjoyed exploring with the Addie and Dylan sort of tension being, I think, you know, I think also with, you know, with women at a certain age as well, you know, we're in a very positive moment of celebrating like the power of female friendship, but I'm really interested in its complexities too, or it's more fun to write about the complexities, I think. And no relationship that involves true intimacy doesn't have multiple sides. And so at this life stage where women's circumstances begin to diverge so much, like, you know, who's getting married, or you having kids, or neither, career versus family, our role in propping up one another's belief systems necessarily evolves. And with this can come crossed wires and insecurity and misunderstanding. And it was really interesting to sort of augment this by being in a city like New York, where complicity is so fundamental to survival. You know, by this I mean at least you need your inner circle to agree that despite, you know, the rents and the roaches and the insane day jobs and the confrontation, that New York, the idea is still worth it. And I think Dylan beginning to poke at that a bit creates like a glitch in the matrix. Do you know what I mean? It's like, you know, particularly for Addie, who shares a lot of the same uncertainty, but isn't ready or willing to stare it down. So she takes it very personally. And I think also, you know, likewise for Dylan, her Sally has always operated for her a bit like New York, you know, providing a constant sense of challenge and motion. So Sally moving out of the city and seeming to conform to some, like, albeit loose model of domesticity is really discombobulating. So I'm really interested in these tendrils. Do you know what I mean? And they're very strong in New York, because you find your people. You need to. It's that kind of city.
Yes.
But then you really rely on them. Like, you've all got on the same raft. And if someone stops rowing, or like, you're just like, whoop, you know, it's kind of like a sort of, I don't know, it's a bit like a Jenga. It's like, how many pieces can one person take out before the whole thing? Anyway. Yeah.
I think it's so interesting that sense of kind of like, I love the way that you created the characters in the book and the cast of characters in the book and the people that surround Dylan, the, you know, her kind of social capital. It was such a wonderful kind of breadth of people. I particularly loved Hazel, who's in it for just a moment, but is just the most fantastic person in the world.
Like a manifestation of what you want to bump into in New York, but I never quite did. I have to admit though, the other guy, Ezra, who is also in that bar scene, is very closely, but I can only say this because I don't think he would ever find this podcast, very closely based on someone I met in a bar like that, which I have to say, this is again how I differ from my character. That was my absolute mecca in New York. I cannot tell you. It was one of those, one of those things, and not to sound like a cliche, but where you feel like you found the lost New York. But I loved then taking that in the book and sort of, it's that thing about the sort of the relay, people trying to keep the idea of the city going. It is a team effort, even though everyone has a completely different New York in their head that they think they've arrived in. And I loved this guy in his 70s sort of trying to repeat himself in his 20s, trying to keep this old bar alive that used to be, sorry to be graphic, you can edit this out, but the only place he could get a hand job or whatever, but like sort of repeating and failing to deliver his lines with meaning. I don't know, the joy of that is just sort of, it is that thing where people love to say like, oh, only in New York, and it always really, I find it irritating. I'm just like, but seriously, in that situation. But yeah, I loved writing Hazel. And it is that gorgeous sense of, and it's something that really is one of the great things about that city, is doing things on your own and the people that talk to you. I feel like there's a very British thing of like fear of people on their own, like, oh gosh, we mustn't get lumbered, so, it's that yes, exactly. Whereas in New York, it's this, it's another audience, particularly with New Yorkers. Here's someone who hasn't heard my story yet. And I love that. I'm like, give it to me. I'm here for it, But yeah.
No, he was so great. I also want to quickly scurry back to Sally because she was brilliant, and I don't think I will ever recover from the line. I've got it written down somewhere. I masturbated to the Argonauts furiously in the first term of my MBA. That section about claiming your desires, fuck. That is art.
I love it. I mean, it feels like a great way. And Maggie Nelson deserves someone to climax with her. I mean, 100%. Are you a fan? I absolutely love her writing. But, again, it's that thing of taking something to an extreme. It's not something I personally have done, not that you need that information, but the freedom with which she writes about the body and the borderlessness and the limitlessness, it's so extraordinary to read as someone who's fairly conservative, probably, by comparison. So it's a joy to write a character like Sally, who is just, inside her body and everything's connected. I think with Dylan, she's either inside her body or inside her brain. And there is a problem connecting the two. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the huge appeal of Gabe. She's about to enter a rather like harrowing, unhelpfully intellectual process of like, who am I? What do I want? What are my values? What, all of this kind of stuff. And there's something so wonderfully irrational about that. It's animal, and it, there is no room for that kind of exercise. But yeah, I love Sally too.
Yeah, she was great. And you kind of touched on it before about like the complexities of female friendship and what interested you about that, but I think it was such an interesting sort of contrast between Addie and Sally, because I just completely panicked and thought I'd got Sally's name wrong, but it's definitely Sally. But I mean, like, Sally is, she's not, I don't want to say like a yes man, because she's not a man, but like she kind of doesn't tell Dylan, I don't agree with what you're doing here, or I think maybe, are you doing this, are you doing something right for yourself? Like, are you okay with what you're doing for yourself? Like, she just kind of allows Dylan to make those choices. And I don't know how best to describe it, but then you've got Addie, and you almost feel like Addie's judging her, and she can sense Addie's judgment. And I think there was just such an interesting contrast between the two, because you can tell Addie's someone that's quite responsible, but Sally isn't. And what those kind of different friendships feed Dylan was so interesting to read.
I think also there's like a fundamental difference, which is probably the thing I was homing in on a bit, of Sally doesn't need anything from Dylan, and that is probably the most healthy version of friendship I can imagine. I'm very embroiled in my friendships, and I have needs, and I give a lot and I need a lot and all that kind of stuff. And Sally can sort of be there for her, watch her. I think actually also, given what I was just saying about her approach to the body and the soul and how everything thinks up, I think she probably thinks it's quite a healthy exercise. And let's remember, Dylan isn't sharing masses about it throughout, you know, some of the slightly more uneasy dynamics. Whereas Addie, on the theme of them all being on their raft in New York, you know, and just her personality anyway, she is so, God, the amount of people I met like that. Luckily, not luckily, I like Addie. I'm very affectionate towards her, but it wasn't the people I gravitated to as sort of close friends. But we're trying so hard to make it work. It's like they're at the final, you know, it's like the final sort of, you know, particularly as I was saying, with, you know, women who get to a certain age as well, where, you know, you expect pieces to have come together and all this kind of stuff. And I think it is really, it's really a challenge for her that, you know, Dylan has played a certain role, who has been this great romantic about New York, who's kept the energy going, who makes the adventure happen, is suddenly sort of tapping out. I think it's like the floor has gone from beneath her, you know, and it is that, you know, that journey of accountability, isn't it? Of sort of a bit like me and with my editor is like, oh crap, it's my book, I have to write it. I can't rely on the way, you know, New York sort of subsidizes. There's this wonderful little book written a long time ago. I can't remember when, but by someone called E.B. White, called Here is New York. And he describes people as arriving in the city either through, and it's quite old fashioned language, through some surfeitive spirit or through some deficiency. And I think it's probably a combination of the two for Dylan, at least. And I think the deficiency evaporates in those first few years because everything feels so full and overstimulated, but then there's, you know, the city recedes a bit and suddenly you're the protagonist again, and that deficiency becomes more and more glaring, which is like, I came here to fill a gap, but I have to fill it. New York can't fill it, my friends can't fill it, you know. So yeah, they were the perfect pair. There was originally it was one of the very helpful editing comments I had. There was originally another character who I really enjoyed, but didn't particularly bring anything new to that section, who disappeared. But I like these three as a trio. And also I did feel I had to make Addie and Sadie childhood friends, because otherwise it seemed quite unrealistic they'd be in the same social group. I was like, how can I make this happen? But again, that's the joy of fiction. There's always a solution for you.
We have to say that this book brought us so much joy. Honestly, it was so much fun, and we cannot recommend it enough to our bookends listening. Before we let you go, I do have to ask you, what are your literary influences?
Well, it's interesting. I think that they probably tend to be the writers I'm most sort of moved by, or who've inspired me to want to write, rather than writers I might have anything in common with necessarily, or could ever hope to emulate. Probably a mixture of old and new, but Virginia Woolf for 1,000 reasons. I think above all, the way she depicts the self as sort of ever-changing and amorphous and contradictory, and how the focus of her novels tend to be on landmarks which are interior, those sort of small flashes of clarity or cohesion that then crumble just as quickly. Also the rhythm of her writing, like she is a master of the sentence, you know, in between the acts she can fit the whole of human history into a line, and then in Mrs. Dalloway she can expand a single moment into a page with equal ease. So, and then contemporary writers, I think Maggie Nelson we've already mentioned, and Sheila Heti. I don't know if you've read any. I mean, they're very different writers, but equally fearless. And I think for both of them, the novel, or whatever mode they're writing in, is a form of questioning. And that's such a confident way to write. There is we're in a soundbite moment in culture where you have to feel like you have to offer up your morsel or take a stance. And for both of them, it feels like more of a meditation or a quest. And I love that about the writing. Also, the way that they mold the form to their inquiry and not vice versa, particularly with Sheila Heti. Have you guys read Motherhood?
No.
I've not read any Sheila Heti yet.
She's so good. Do you know what? She is so great. But I always have the feeling of that's her going on, in many ways, the cycle that Dylan does in the book. How do you rationally think about whether motherhood is right for you when it is such an animal biological thing? Your body's doing one thing, your brain, you know, can you figure it out outside the state of motherhood? But she does it in the most extraordinary way. But she has written another book that's on its way to me now. I think it's literally just come out, called Alphabetical Diaries, which, have you heard of it?
I've heard of it, yeah.
Probably got it in your proof stack. I'm so jealous. Yeah, I'm trying to spy through the screen, but it takes her diary entries from the last 10 years and arranges them alphabetically, which is such an interesting concept. You know, the way I imagine, I haven't read it, but like unexpected synergies will emerge and clashes will make new meanings. And it also really neatly sidesteps what I think is the horror of a diary and why I've never kept one. Is your sense that it should sort of demonstrate some kind of progress in your life, you know what I mean? So the idea of just getting it down and then shuffling the deck is genius, isn't it? It's so good.
Very cool.
Those guys, I think.
That's an amazing list of literary influences. And I really want to talk about something else, but I mean, we are at time, which is why we must round up. But I'm very gutted. You were just touching on motherhood there, and we didn't speak about that because I was very careful about the fact that I didn't want to give too much away with the book, because I feel that's such a significant thing that happens in the book, and that's all I'm going to kind of give to our listeners, because I don't want to give away too much, because that was such a huge moment for me in your book. Before we let you go, I need to ask for a recommendation that you can leave us with.
Okay, so this is a great one. I know you asked this, so I really thought about it hard. Normally I come to things quite late, so I'm not going to think of anything you haven't already done or seen. But this is an Instagram, a guy called Emmett Cohen, who is a young jazz pianist in New York who live streams gigs out of his apartment. Also out in the world, he's a very celebrated musician, but he started doing these gigs in lockdown, which is when I found him, and then just carried on. It's called Live from Emmett's Place. And he gathers a few musicians. I think maybe the double bassist and the drummer seem to be regulars, but singers, other instrumentalists rotate in and out. And he actually recently uploaded one with Samara Joy. Have you heard of her? She won the Grammy for the New Artist Grammy this year.
Yeah.
Almost never happens for a jazz singer. And she has this like old timey, I mean, it's kind of Ella Fitzgerald reincarnated. It's incredible. Wow. But yeah, the vibe of these gigs is just pure energy. And I think like writing is so solitary, and when you see musicians like that improvising as a collective so totally in sync, it's just so joyful. And I should say that also, like, for anyone who thinks they're not much of a jazz person, I would put myself in that category. But this is like everything you want jazz to be and New York to be. This guy's cramped little apartment, and how he just emanates. Also, he's pretty fine. So like, if he's listening to this, I would like my number. You guys can but yeah, it's worth it. It's worth a look. Just like it's impossible not to feel joyful after watching one of those.
That is such a good recommendation. I'm really excited to watch him. So thank you. I believe that your book will be out now when we upload this podcast, because it will be not the Wednesday coming, but the Wednesday after that this will go out. Yeah. So your book will already be out in the UK. Is it going to be out anywhere else?
Well, not as far as I know, but you never know.
But you never know. Let's get it into once our US audience listens to this, they're going to be like, oh my God, I want this book. And hopefully, you know.
Are they going to say it in that voice?
Maybe.
Are they going to? It'd be a dream to have this in a New York bookstore. I might just have to. I've got a 2 boxes of copies here.
Just go and put them out.
Exactly. Fly out and
do it.
Have them.
If you need a helper, I will volunteer myself to come with you to New York if I'm lost. Yeah.
You guys have expenses on the podcast, right? So
amazing. Gorgeous. It's been such a joy to chat to you today, Miranda.
Yeah, thank you.
Where can our listeners find you on social media?
I'm a lurker, really. So like, I'm on Instagram, but there's like one post. So I mean, please feel free to follow me on there. But I'm more, if I put anything up, it will be there. So
perfect. Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on A Pair of Bookends. And for our listeners, How to Be Somebody Else is out now in the UK, and I will pop a link in the show notes for you to buy it. And on our bookshop page, you can buy all of the recommendations that Miranda has been raving about today, which is very exciting. You can also follow us at Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and at Pair of Bookends on Twitter and TikTok. And if you enjoyed this episode, please do rate, review and subscribe so you can boost us in the charts. But yes, Miranda, thank you once again for joining us. It's been such a joy.
Bye.